Hello, horror fans. It's me, Cassandra from the Horrorcraft podcast, and today we have on a very special guest. I am flying solo, and I have the pleasure of talking to David Weiner from the In Search of Darkness documentaries. If you have not had a chance to see these documentaries, they are fantastic. They just had three parts about the 80s, and it's basically like a big love letter to the genre. And now they're moving on to 1990 through 1994. So sit back, relax, put in your butterfly hair clips, keep your Tamagotchi alive, and let's cue the music and talk about the 90s. Cue it. Hello, horror fans. It's me, Cassandra from the Horrorcraft podcast, and I have a very special guest. So today I have the pleasure of talking to David Weiner, who is the mind behind the In Search of Darkness series. And now they're doing 1990 to 1994, and we are super excited. Thank you for coming on, David.
Thanks for having me on, Cassandra. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited. So if you don't know, which I think it's a big juggernaut in the horror community, the In Search of Darkness series, it kind of is just a big visual collection for the horror community. So if you haven't gotten a chance to see it, go ahead and take a look at the previous entries. We'll link all of that in the description down below. But right now we're focusing on 1990 to 1994, which is definitely a tonal shift. But before we get started on that, I just have a few quick questions for you, fun questions. There are
Sure.
some 90s icebreakers. The first
Okay.
one is, what's your favorite scary movie?
My favorite scary movie. Well, that's always a tough one. And I'm sure people say that. I think
Mhm.
everyone who loves movies and is a movie fan is, they can say, oh, my favorite movie is this, but it depends on your mood and the day, arguably the time of year. It is spooky season. But since we're talking about 90s movies, I'm just going to, rather than say my favorite movie, there's so many that I could pick from a hat. I am going to go with, I'm just going to pick Exorcist 3 right now.
Ooh, that's a good
It
pick.
could be anything. I just have to clarify. It's always a tough question because I'm incapable of giving a single answer that I will stand by because I just love too many choices. And I'll just stick with some 90s, stuff today thematically.
Yeah, definitely. I understand. I think as horror fans, our answers always change, always evolve, and just depends on what mood we're in at this point in time. So
I mean, if you
obviously,
look at my shirt, I've got Amityville
Amityville
Horror, but that's
horror.
1979, so
Right. So, what is your favorite 90s trend? There were a lot of 90s trends that were going around at that point in time. Is there one that sticks out in your mind?
that's a good question because I have not started getting these trend questions yet about pop culture. I was a 70s kid, an 80s teen, and a 90s 20 something. There you go. I'm showing my age right there off the bat. I don't mind. And so it's funny when you're living in the 90s, um, the trends are things that I don't know, it's like things that I think we take for granted now are kind of new then. It's like all of a sudden everyone had to go get something from Abercrombie and Fitch, or grunge, of course, and that kind of music. There was lots of really great music that was sort of a snapback to the music of the 80s. But it's funny, the first thing that popped into my mind was a trend I didn't understand then and I still don't understand now, and that's pogs.
Yeah.
For Pogs,
Yeah.
I was too old for Pogs, but I remember Pogs were just like insane, and everyone had to have a Pog, and we're throwing Pogs and collecting Pogs, and swallowing Pogs that they probably shouldn't have. So anyway, I'll go with that. Do you have a particular '90s trend that comes to mind?
So for me, like, I'll show my age. I was in elementary school in the 90s, because my birth year is 1990. So I just remember having butterfly clips all
Mhm.
over my hair growing up. And for some reason, I just wanted to be like a butterfly. Like I just wore those all the time. And I had a lot of like, I don't know, they were like fairy like art stuff that was in the 90s. And I just remember I was like, I just want to be a fairy growing up. So I think for that, it stands out to me as
I
like one of the few things, plus a Tamagotchi. Like I could never keep
yeah.
my Tamagotchi alive.
I remember there was a Tamagotchi going around the office, and everyone was obsessed with it. And then people would dump it on each other because they tried to kill it, and it was very hard.
Yeah, and now Tamagotchis are
People
back.
want to try it, and I felt sorry. I just felt absolutely guilty trying to off my Tamagotchi pet, because it just wouldn't die. It just got sick, and there were flies would buzz around it, and it was like they really torture you. You can't just you can't turn it off.
No, you cannot. So, and now they're back. My son has a Tamagotchi, so it's very interesting to see how that's like cycled through. So,
It's funny that you mentioned that because I contemplated getting one for my son, who's 11 years old, and I thought that he would think it was cool. And then I just remember how uncool it was when I was just trying to like ignore it, and I didn't want to put him through that emotional damage.
right.
Maybe it's a good responsibility thing. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. What is an underrated 90s horror movie in your opinion?
Underrated horror movie in the 90s. I always find that to be a tough question because, as you know, I really specialize in many, many of the underrated movies, which
Yes.
which I think everyone loves for one reason or another. So, it goes to the word underrated. What does that mean? Does that mean, cult? Does that mean not so many people have seen it? Does that mean you really have to introduce people to it? Um, I think uh, Stuart Gordon's Pit and the Pendulum from Full Moon Entertainment is an underrated movie because that one is really, it's got amazing production design, shot in Italy at Charlie Van's castle. Um, Lance Henriksen as Thomas Torquemada. Jeffrey Combs is in it. It's got great production value and it's real dark. And, everyone in that group, they love Edgar Allan Poe and it shows. So I would say that's amid the pantheon of Full Moon Entertainment movies that came out, especially in the early '90s, that seems to be the one, alongside Puppet Master or Netherworld or
Yeah.
Demonic Toys or films of that ilk. For some reason, Pit and the Pendulum just sort of gets lost in the mix, and so I'm here to tell everyone that you should check it out because it's underrated. Pit
Yeah.
and the Pendulum.
Yeah, it's a great one.
Can
What
I ask
it
you? Can I throw these back at you while we're
Yeah,
doing this?
yeah. I would definitely say one that I think a lot of people either don't know about or don't give enough credit to is Sometimes They Come Back,
Ooh,
by Stephen
mhm,
King. I
yeah.
think it's absolutely wonderful. It's a rockabilly kind of murder revenge kind of tale, that also deals with like this deep level of trauma that this man is dealing with the loss of his brother.
Mm.
So I think it's one that gets lost a lot when we're talking about Stephen King movies.
Also,
Um,
because it's a TV movie,
yeah,
and Stephen King in the '90s was white hot when it came to TV movies. You've got
yeah,
it, you've got The Stand, but then you got things like the Tommy Knockers and the Langoliers, and it
yes,
gets all over the map. But um, Robert Rustler, who's in Sometimes They Come Back, and I spoke with him in Search of Darkness in the '80s trilogy. He made an effort to talk about that because that was a movie that meant a lot to him. He really enjoyed being part of that.
yeah. I just feel like we talk about horror movies that heal. I find a lot of people that have had things that have happened in their past are very drawn to that movie. So I just think that it's a really good representation of the good side of Stephen King TV movies. And that really gets lost in the fray. So, but I like your answer as well. So, as a horror fan, what is your favorite thing about being a horror fan?
I love the diversity of the genre. I love how there are so many subgenres within horror, and it has built a community that, compared to so many other fan communities, um, there's a lot less toxicity in the horror community. Not saying that there isn't some, and there isn't, virtue signaling, and all that kind of fun
Yeah.
stuff. But, I've found very much so that the horror community is very supportive of any choice you make. When you say a certain thing is your film, they say rah rah, absolutely, go for it. But I love the diversity of the genre and how it ranges from, comedy to torture porn and everything in between. But internationally, there are just so many great titles. I'm always discovering new stuff. There's so much out there because it's also one of the most successful uh, genres in filmmaking in terms of success at the box office. Usually, it only takes $3 to make a movie. You could put it out there. You can find it either straight to video, but so many of the films that again didn't take much, the audience finds it, and the audience shows up on that first weekend, and that's why you get 10 Saw movies, because people are always hungry for more. And it's whatever what's your whistle.
Yeah, I agree. So, obviously with doing this, I'm a special needs mom from Ohio,
Mm.
and this was kind of my midlife crisis, if you want to say that. 30-year-old crisis. When I turned 30, I was just like, I've always wanted to do something in horror. What can I provide? And I kind of for a minute thought, well, what do I, a mom in Ohio, have to offer to the horror genre? But everyone's been so welcoming. And I do think it's just everyone is a fan at the end of the day. You have that inner horror fan that's just welcoming to everyone. And it's like, okay, new horror, new ideas, new this continues the genre that we all love. So we're all just that kid in the VHS store trying to look for the new movie at the end of
Yeah.
the day. So,
I commend you for putting a podcast together and putting your passion for a genre to something that people can listen to and relate to and connect with. And you talk with friends and you interview people who are part of the industry. These are all wonderful things. It is something not only that you can do, it's something that you've done. So
yeah,
keep it.
thank you. I appreciate that. So, the last thing is what is your favorite horror icon? I know for me, Elvira is the be all end all. Happy birthday, Elvira. Um, but Cassandra
Mhm.
Peterson, sorry. But what is your favorite horror icon? It could be from the 90s or any genre in general. I mean, any
Sure.
time period.
I think maybe Sam Raimi comes to mind, because he cut his teeth with his pals in Michigan just to make some fun horror movies. Again, it sort of goes back to, you take $3 and lots of talent and intention, and you can make a really good thing. And not only did he do that, but he evolved in the industry to obviously tremendous heights. But what does he always come back to? Horror. He'll come back to horror. He'll do For the Love of the Game about baseball, but he'll come back to Drag Me to Hell, or he'll produce more Evil Dead sequels, or he'll do a Marvel movie, and he'll make the first Marvel gateway horror movie with Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. I mean, I took my kid to that movie saying, I'm not sure if you can see this because you might be too scared. And he's like, bring it on, Dad. And he's like, this is my favorite Marvel movie. And he loved all the horror elements in that. So Sam Raimi is the one who kind of comes to mind as a icon to revere.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. Sam Raimi is always doing all kinds of different things. Like I absolutely love that he can do everything in horror, but then you'll see him be involved in projects like Xena and Hercules when I was growing up, but then come back and do Spartacus and
Mhm.
have this really bloody, gory, like Roman Empire tale that kind of harks back to his horror roots, but then go back to his horror roots with Evil
Mhm.
Dead and everything like that. So I think that's a great answer. So, well, thank you so much for doing the icebreakers.
Sure.
Um, but so we're going to get started into talking about In Search of Darkness. And
Mhm.
this particular In Search of Darkness deals with films from 1990 till 1994. What do you think is the significance of this time period for the In Search of Darkness documentaries?
Well, first, I'll just sort of preface all of this by saying that we're gearing up for production of In Search of Darkness '90s with pre-sale from October 6th to Halloween night, October 31st, and just go to 90shorrordoc.com. And our socials are all still 80s horror doc, but it's all pretty much 90s material now. We figure don't change the channel; it's harder to find.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
I go to 90shorrordoc.com, and that's where you can find out all the information about what we're doing and what it's about, and so on and so forth. And uh, the 90s was, first of all, I'll just say the drumbeat for the 90s was deafening. After doing a trilogy of 80s horror movies, it literally, for those who are unfamiliar with the In Search of Darkness documentaries, I'll just preface super quickly that uh, the first one, part one, and then we did part two, part three, they're all 4 to 5 hour documentaries. And the reason why they're that long is A, because they're crowdfunded, but B, because they take a look at a decade and they go year by year. So from 1980 to 1989, within each year, there's a number of films that we discuss. There's larger context chapters in between about everything from the special effects to the heroes to the villains to the filmmakers to the filmmaking process and the era itself. But what's important is we get upwards of 50, sometimes 60 icons of the era who tell the story themselves. And they talk about not only their films, but they also talk about the films that influenced them and that they love and admire as well. And that's everyone from, John Carpenter and Robert Englund and Heather Langenkamp to, if they were in the movie that you love, hopefully we got them. And if we tried or they're not around, unfortunately, like Wes Craven, for example. Um, the 90s was a era of transition. What we're doing this time around is we're doing In Search of Darkness '90s in two parts, and so we're doing 1990 to 1994, and then we're going to do a part two, 95 to 1999. But these are huge labor of love projects by a very small team. And so we're trying something a little different that's a little more manageable this time, but we still are also able to get a huge amount of material uh, by doing it in this structure versus in one film, covering one decade, and then doing a part two, and then arguably a part three if people want. So I don't think I've answered your question yet, but I feel like there's so much groundwork I need to explain to people.
No, no, yeah, that's perfectly that's great because like I was saying off camera, for me, I was watching it during COVID.
Mm.
And so, 4 or 5 hours for each one didn't seem like a lot for me because I put it on the background and I would be cleaning, doing whatever I need to do. And like I said, I would write down, the different ones that I hadn't seen, and then I just started a list. But it's a lot of ground to cover. And even when you think about 4 or 5 hours, and it's a lot of movies in one single shot, and that could be intensive.
Yeah, well, the way it's designed, it's you could walk away at any given time. You don't have to
Right.
watch. Anyone who does watch straight through, I applaud you. And it moves fast, and that is very much credit to Samuel Way, my editor, who puts these together, and it does an amazing job. It just makes it fly. But you could literally just like watch one year and one chapter in between, and then take a break and come back the next night and watch over a week. Um, the 90s when we were done with this third 80s In Search of Darkness, so many people were just like, please do 90s, please do 90s, please do 90s. People are also like, please do the 70s, please do a different decade. But I think the time is right. I think people really are reveling in the 90s right now, and in
Hmm.
the nostalgia of it. Shockingly, it was like 30 years ago.
Right.
Or give or take. But what was really interesting is a lot of people look at this decade of film as almost like something that a lot of people overlook. Because the 80s was so strong, the output was so intense in the 80s. It spilled over just on the shelves of the video stores where there are things that never even appeared in the cinema. But that's something that is part of the appreciation of that whole era, is just going to Blockbuster or your mom and pop shop and seeing Dr. Giggles, seeing, Frankenstein Unbound by Roger Corman, seeing Puppet Master 2, Puppet Master 3, which never got theatrical. All the Full Moon stuff went straight to video, Demonic Toys, which I happen to work on.
That's
um,
amazing.
but those were the kinds of things that at the same time in the cinemas there was a kind of a renaissance of horror because all the big studios wanted to get into the horror game too. So you've got big budget, especially with Silence of the Lambs, all of a sudden horror is big. But the thing is, they're kind of afraid to call it horror. They're like, well, people don't like that genre. We'll call it a thriller, a psychological thriller. If it's about serial killers, it's still a thriller. People are being killed one by one, but don't call it a horror movie. It's a very interesting time, but you still have these big budget movies like Coppola doing, Francis Ford Coppola doing, Bram Stoker's Dracula. You've got Kenneth Branagh doing Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. You have Jack Nicholson saying, I think it's time for me to be a werewolf in a werewolf movie. Let's do Wolf.
Yeah,
Um,
but people
and
were, like you were saying, people were afraid to kind of label it horror because even with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and then like Bram Stoker's Dracula, Francis Ford Coppola doing it, they want to say it's gothic horror and not actually like horror because then it's a little softer. When in reality, some of those movies, I know even me watching Dracula back, Dracula, Francis Ford Coppola's edition is violent and is like in the parameters of a horror movie. So
well,
I do go ahead.
it, what you're pointing out is something that is really interesting that went on is that they wanted to, it's sort of the beginning of the quote unquote elevated horror concept that wasn't necessarily, we didn't call it that back then. But they're clearly, if it's Bram Stoker's Dracula, then it's trying to elevate the literary element. It's sort of going after, rather than the lowest common denominator, the highest echelon should be able to approach this. And obviously, when that did very well, rather than we're going to remake Frankenstein, they're like, well, no, it's got to be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I add that literary element to it. It's very interesting because horror was really searching for its identity. There was too much, and in the 80s, arguably for some people, it was not for us. But I think because it overflowed with a lot of lowest common denominator stuff. The big screen films were really trying to sort of redefine it, and the filmmakers who were making these films were trying to redefine themselves as well. Wes Craven, in the early 90s, we're on Nightmare on Elm Street 6. Freddy's dead, and they kill off Freddy, but guess what? We still want more. So he's coming back in a new Nightmare where Wes Craven is playing with sort of meta filmmaking pre-screen, right there with the sort of self-aware, self-reverential type of storyline. You got People Under the Stairs, which is more of a reflection of The Hangover from the 80s, where you had corporate greed and all that kind of stuff like that. and the trickle down economics was not trickling down, and everything. You've got riots in the streets, literally, in Los Angeles, and the haves and the have-nots. The disparate difference between them is it's now being reflected on the big screen. So there's so much going on. There's so much more to chew. I'm sort of in pitch mode now, so I'll just be
No,
quiet. Let
no,
this answer. But
I was laughing, well, smiling because New Nightmare was actually my first horror movie.
oh,
Um,
you're kidding.
no, yeah, it was. My uncle and my father, well, my uncle was a huge Freddy Krueger fan. My uncle and father were watching me and thought that I was asleep, and I was faking it the whole time, and I stayed asleep and watched the whole thing.
Watching
So
with one eye open on the
yeah,
couch.
so, Freddy Krueger has always kind of been near and dear to my heart because it was my uncle's favorite, so, it's always been a kind of connection back to him, for me, but do you feel for the '90s, I think the biggest thing is obviously one of the things that you touch pointed on was the video store. How do you think the rise of video stores changed horror in the '90s?
It allowed it to proliferate because people like Charlie Band, who I mentioned, Roger Corman, who I mentioned, Lloyd Kaufman, a lot of these entrepreneurial producers were creating so much stuff that they no longer needed the gatekeeper studios to release their stuff. They could go straight to the video store. All they needed was a great cover and repeat viewing. There were so many titles that, for me personally, this was then, not now. I was a bit of a snob, and I'm like, well, if it hasn't had a theatrical release, I probably won't pay attention. But sometimes you just couldn't resist those insane covers, that cover art, and I'm just like, all right, I'm only going to walk by Jack Frost two more times, then I finally have to rent Jack Frost. I finally have to get, some of these Stranger Things. All right, fine, you got me. I'm going to watch Carnosaur. It doesn't matter whether it was theatrical or not. And sometimes on a Friday night, you wanted something, you want to not Netflix and chill, but you wanted to just sort of relax and turn off your brain and watch something fun and ridiculous. And there was so much available. And the video store, for those people who are not necessarily pining for the days of yore when we had to go out and search for our films and spend an hour doing circles, trying to figure out what we do all, watch together as a family and come back with a stack, you know. It took a while, and sometimes if there was one title that you wanted, they didn't have it, so you started exploring all these other titles that you're like, I knew I'd get that to eventually. And now it's time for me to get Brain Dead. That one just looks ridiculous. Now it's time for me to get Street Trash. Now it's time for me to watch Ice Cream Man. All these things and then you watch these things and you're just like, this is ridiculously fun. And I don't care what anyone thinks about it. I'm totally going to recommend this to all my friends. And that's how word of mouth spreads. And that's why there was a whole sort of like sub level of appreciation of horror film in the 90s that carried over from the 80s, thanks to the video stores.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you're saying. Like I know for me, one that stands out that like the cover art, I didn't rent it from a video store. I just watched it a couple years ago, but Frankenhooker, I know that's
Uh-huh.
one that like definitely pulls to me like the cover art. Dr. Giggles, like you were talking about.
Yeah,
Dr. Giggles is one of my favorite. I always recommend it to people because I mean he's killing people with oversized medical instruments, like with a
yeah.
Band-Aid and stuff.
I still don't know why they only made one. That's
Yeah.
something that we expected them clearly an effort to build a franchise. So that's actually a story that I need to sort of dive into and find out why there weren't more. You ended up getting The Dentist, which was obviously different, but ironically, it's with Corbin Burnson, the other guy from L.A. Law,
Yeah. Well,
because
and
Larry Drake was in L.A. Law as well.
yeah, and it's kind of funny. We've actually so I'm on Clubhouse a lot with different horror fandoms and we did one with the dentist versus Dr.
Uh
Giggles.
huh.
And I'm like Larry Drake is obviously just going to smother the dentist. Like
Well, was there, give me the tea, spill the tea on that
uh
versus.
oh yeah, everyone said Dr. Giggles. I mean, like the dentist, he snaps and he kills people and it's like a whole thing with him. And yeah, he's frightening, but Dr. Giggles, I mean, he's just inherently like he thinks that what he's doing is the right thing because he's just been so indoctrined from such a young age, seeing his father killing these people, that he feels like he's, with Holly Marie Combs' character, he's helping her. He's going to help save her life. And he just feels so passionately about it. I think somebody like that and somebody that's a bigger than life character like Dr. Giggles, and especially someone that's played by Larry Drake, who honestly was fantastic in every role that he did, whether it was him being on Tales from the Crypt or Darkman.
Right?
Um, he's just a great character to begin with, but his character in Dr. Giggles, I mean, you just can't go up against that kind of just in your face silliness. So I think a lot of people agreed with it. But that's kind of our version, I think, now of the video store is, you know, going on Clubhouse and being able to have groups on Clubhouse where you talk about certain movies, because you don't really get that conversation anymore. It's like, when you go to the video store, you'd be able to strike up a conversation with maybe somebody
Yeah,
else
you
who's
could say,
working
did you
there.
ever see this? Or people you just can't resist saying, oh, that's really good, or oh, I didn't know.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting with, Dr. Giggles, there's a lot of new villains that were introduced in the 90s. But I think people forget that it was intermingled with lots of carryover from the 80s too. You had more Pinhead and Hellraiser, you had Leatherface, you had Child's Play 2 and 3 in the first half of the 90s. But then hand in hand with that, you've got oh, and Jason, I can't forget more Michael Myers, more Jason. Jason Goes to Hell, and then you get Freddy versus Jason down the line a little bit. But hand in hand with that, you also have Candyman. You've got Hannibal Lecter. You've got Kathy Bates in Misery. Annie Wilkes. There's just a brand new sort of group that's finding its footing and is super cool, balanced with all that stuff. You have all these sort of one and done Clive Barker creations, and
Yeah,
Nightbreed.
like my favorite is Nightbreed.
Mm-hmm.
And that is definitely a very I'm glad that we have the cut we have now, but that is I think, I don't know about you, this is kind of my next question, but do you feel like part of the tonal shift in the 90s is with all the 80s horror that we got, the 90s we see them experimenting with more themes. So you have like Nightbreed, where the who you actually think is the monsters is not the actual villain. It's, David Cronenberg's character, who is this very polished, put together person. You have also that kind of concept with even The Crow, and where, Eric Draven, you think that he's going to be the bad guy because he got brought back to life, when really he's the vengeful spirit and it's him turning everything else on its head. Do you feel like that's a common thing that got brought up in the 90s? Because
I
I
think
kind of see that.
I do. I do. I think you've singled out an important element, is that the villains in these movies are either misunderstood monsters more often than not, or they're the corporate villain, the corporate greed villain. The Gordon Geckos of the world are even more evil. Or it's literally the innocent person next door, and lots of serial killer movies, wolves in sheep's clothing, and that connects with the real life stories of Jeffrey Dahmer and so on. It all just sort of converged where the 90s were creating sort of antagonists that were much more gritty and grounded, because I think by the time the 80s was really up and running, people got a little tired of the slasher genre. Not entirely, but many people did. And they also encapsulated horror as to the slasher genre really just sort of defined it, even though we as horror fans know that it was incredibly diverse and full of subgenres and full of imagination. But I think what happened was it's sort of like the snapback with the music. You know,
Hmm.
the music went back to basics with Nirvana and Pearl Jam and grunge. You know, just plug in a guitar, an amp. You know, put your flannel around your waist and just jam. I think horror sort of went back to basics in a grungier, dirtier way, but it was also mixed with cinematography being much more slick and much more evocative cinematically. So you could have people like Oliver Stone doing Natural Born Killers about the killers next door on a killer spree and the insanity of media, another meta thing. But it's all about the people next door, versus these sort of larger than life imaginative killers. And even with Nightbreed, that's a story about misunderstood monsters. It's the POV of the monsters who really aren't monsters, but they have their own community, and if they're the other, of course, Clive Barker is always talking about, all sorts of things, whether it's, the AIDS crisis or being gay. These are things that the horror is a reflection of in terms of perception of other communities. So, it's very interesting. But I think there was very much that sort of shift when we got into the 90s. There's way too much to talk about.
Yeah,
People are
there,
just like, oh, the 90s, that sucked until Scream showed up. And then you start
but there
paying
really
attention.
isn't. But yeah, there's a lot of other ones. And my last question to you is, um, with a project like this, what do you think is the importance of doing something like the In Search of Darkness series for the horror community?
I think these movies they accomplish a number of things. I think maybe first and foremost uh, they with a sense of nostalgia and celebration versus judgment, they tap a button in all of us where it kind of validates that these are the movies that we love and that there's a whole community that loves these as well. Yet we've been in a larger world that is essentially dismissed, if not ridiculed, horror as a genre, because there are so many people who do not understand horror. My mom doesn't get it. My wife also kind of, she gets it, but she doesn't like a lot of horror because she can't necessarily suspend her disbelief. She sees the horror in the horror more often than not. Um, and so it's one of those things where I think these movies do a service in that it validates for so many of us a lot of the films that weren't just the big hits and box office successes, but they were the straight to video things that we would all share with each other. This puts that all on an even playing field where we talk about each and every one, why it's important, how it fits into the zeitgeist puzzle of filmmaking and in pop culture in the 90s. And it just is all, like I said, validated by the people who made these movies, who love to celebrate and just admire the work of their contemporaries and their peers. And so it's like sitting in the back of a bar closes, but you get to sit in that table in the back at 3 a.m. with the great filmmakers and the experts of the genre, just having a great laugh and learning new stories and just enjoying the movies that we all loved and saying, you love that too? Well, have you ever heard of this one? Oh, that's the best one. Oh no, I got to put that on my list. That's what these movies really accomplish, in my opinion.
Yeah, I do. I like that. And I like the fact that you take not only the stories behind it and the people behind it, but then you also have a lot of different horror creators as well that get involved in the project too. So it's like this huge smattering of just a snapshot of what the horror community is. And it's everyone getting together, just like you said, on this even playing field that just really goes back to that blockbuster day feeling where, you picking out your favorite horror movie and someone's like, "Oh my gosh, I love that too." And you're like, "I love it as well." And you just start talking and it's like that connection piece. I just love that that's what that's doing in the horror community because I think we all kind of sometimes forget with all the stuff going on in the ether, that feeling, and it's projects like this that kind of bring that back together.
Mm.
So I definitely think that that's what this is doing. So thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Sure, sure. Well, I appreciate your appreciation of these movies and what they do. You know, I don't stand on my soapbox saying, you know, these are movies, these documentaries, the In Search of Dark, you know, so In Search of Darkness. I can't speak anymore. I'm done. Can't stand on my soapbox and say these In Search of Darkness documentaries are important with a capital I. What they have done is they've resonated with the horror community, and if anything, it prompts more understanding, infotainment, education, entertainment, and just a greater appreciation of some of the films that you might have dismissed in the past. Me as a filmmaker making these movies and choosing what gets to go in there, and getting to sit down with my horror heroes and have just human conversations about these movies and the making of stories. It's amazing to me, just as the guy who gets to make these, to rediscover so many of the things. I mean, watching a lot of these 90s movies to get In Search of Darkness 90 to 94 going, uh, I haven't seen some of these movies in 20 or 30 years. I watch a lot of stuff. If I really love it, I watch it again and again and again. You know, I'll be the first to say that I watch, you know, Tom Savini's Night of the Living Dead, uh, you know, remake because it's spectacular, and it's part of my spooky season ritual that as I'm getting into October, I have to put that on because it puts me, you know, it gets me in the mood. And
Yeah, no,
so, but just, you know, I there's so many that I haven't seen in the longest time, and I'm watching them like, oh my God, it's like I'm seeing them with brand new eyes. This is so fun.
yeah, I really appreciate that because I know, like you were saying, your mom doesn't get it and your wife sort of doesn't get it either. That was kind of my experience growing up in, rural Ohio. I live by the lake, and there aren't too many people at that point in time when I was growing up that kind of had those same feelings, even though, like, I live by Cedar Point. So, like, that's one of the big horror places with Hollow weekends and stuff like that, but there weren't a lot of people that were like, "Oh, that's great." And my mother, like, God love her, but, Kung Fu Panda is too violent for her. So talking
Okay,
about, like
fair enough.
talking about, like, certain horror movies, like, she would just be like, "No, like, why are you watching that?" Like, I remember watching Killer Clowns from Outer Space and telling her about it, and it freaked me out the first time I watched it. And then I was telling her about it, and she's like, "Why did you watch that? Why did you put yourself through it?" Because it was fun, and I thought it was great, and even though it scared me, like, I liked it. So, but I think that's what these documentaries do, and I know for me, that's kind of that feeling, is that acceptance of, "Oh, yeah, I wasn't the only one that felt that way," and kind of
Mhm.
bringing along the things that we're doing. So, I
I,
really do appreciate
I
it.
think just to round out that point, I think you're absolutely right. You know, and it kind of goes back to even like Famous Monsters of Film Line magazine, you know, which I was lucky enough to be the editor for you know, a couple of years of that. But I bring that up because that was when people were reading this magazine and reading all of the fan letters, you know, the fan mail, and realizing that they weren't alone. You know, prohibitive back in the late 50s and the 60s, Romania was happening. So many parents just did not get it. And so it could be very isolating as a horror fan, you know, especially if you're not a confident one who wants to fly your horror freak flag. You know, you sit there and you just say, is something wrong with me? Because everyone's telling me something's wrong with me. But it's just a genre, and it's an appreciation of a type of storytelling fundamentally, and it's a way of getting your sort of certain feelings and frustrations out vicariously through death and dismemberment on the big screen or the small screen, prevents you from maybe doing something rash yourself, or at least just as some sort of vindication that, you know, I'm frustrated, this will just make me, this is my comfort food. A lot of people don't understand that. And so, you know, movies like the In Search of Darkness documentaries, magazines, Famous Monsters, Fangoria, clubhouse chats with like-minded horror fans and fiends. All this stuff is very therapeutic and it's good for you. And it's, creative minds need their outlets too.
Yeah, we call it horror that heals for
Hmm.
us. It's a horror gives you an outlet, whether good, bad, in between, that you can it's the middle ground. You can kind of go in, and whether it's a good or a bad, it kind of helps you wrestle some things out that maybe not another genre would.
Sure.
So
Your
it's
therapist might not get it either, so you got to get a
yeah, I
hold.
mean, your therapist probably won't, but it's okay. As horror fans, we get it.
Right.
So, but thank you so much for coming on. I greatly appreciate it. And please, the crowdfunding starts on October 6th, for this. And like he said, goes until Halloween. If you're looking for a better way to start off spooky season, I couldn't find a better way to do that than starting into this. So please go check it out. All the information will be in the link down below for this video, or if you're listening to this via your podcast streamer, it'll be in the link in description.
Yeah, I'll
So
just throw it out verbally: 90shorrordoc.com,
mhm.
90s horrordoc.com. Yeah, pre-sales between October 6th and October 31st, and lots of fun. And I'm excited to get this one going.
Yeah, and I'm excited to see how this is going to shape out. So thank you so much for coming on. And until next time, it's me, Cassandra from the Horrorcraft podcast, and stay spooky. Bye.